Hello, and welcome to this Enterprise Connect session, How to be a Leader in Diversity and Inclusion. My name is Ryan Daly, Associate Editor for No Jitter and Enterprise Connect. I'll be your moderator for today's session. Before we start, I would like to bring up a few housekeeping items. If you haven't taken the time to review our Code of Conduct, please do take a minute to review as to ensure that your participation is in accordance with our policy of respectful discourse. Also, if you are experiencing any technical issues, please leave a comment in the chat window below and a representative will help you. And before I introduce our panel for today, I wanted to note that at Enterprise Connect and No Jitter, we support and encourage diverse and inclusive voices. While this panel does not have the diversity makeup that we had planned for, we made every effort to include and offer opportunities to people of all backgrounds and will continue to work on adding more diverse voices to our program in the future. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our panelist of leading diversity and inclusion experts. And joining us today, we have Dr. Alexandria White, Director of Diversity for Reboot Excel, Diane Flynn, co-founder and CEO of Reboot Excel, and Johanna Lyman, Principal Consultant and Practice Lead for Culture and Inclusion at Cadabra. On behalf of the Enterprise Connect team, I wanted to thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to this conversation. So before we dive into kind of the meat of today's conversation, I was hoping we can just go around and do some brief introductions. Can you just tell us a little bit about your work and just what diversity means to you, and maybe throw in like one fun fact. So Alexandria, why don't we start with you?
Hello, Ryan. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Hello to fellow panelists, as well as our listeners. Diversity means so much to me. Personally, it's a work of passion. As a woman of color, as a single mother, as a first-generation college student, as a community activist, diversity encompasses just a personal passion of mine. One thing that I'm very, very keen on is that diversity is just not about race. It's about socioeconomic status. It's about ableism. It's about sexuality. It's about religion, political affiliation. One thing that has been a catalyst for my diversity work started in 2013 with the murder of Trayvon Martin. Ever since then, I have been a proponent of educating people about social justice, about police brutality. And so when you talk about personal and being related to diversity, that is one public act that propelled my work to be more intentional in the diversity and social justice space. A fun fact about me is I went skydiving at 13,000 feet, loved it. So that's my interesting fact.
Well, that's wonderful, and thank you for that introduction. Diane, why don't we go to you next?
Right. Well, I'll start with one of my fun facts, which is that I get to work with Dr. Alex White every day. So that certainly has enriched my life. I do this work because I believe in unleashing human potential. And I think that's accomplished through creating more inclusive workplaces and also empowering individuals. And so that's the work we really do, is work with companies to help ensure that they are aware of bias, that they have the language to have courageous conversations around all the things that Dr. White just mentioned. And also we do a lot of coaching with my specialty, my little is women. And I've written a book with my partner, Patty White, about gender equity in the workplace, a book called The Upside. And it's we found that there's so many things that people from underrepresented groups, whether it's women or other, just don't have the confidence and access points that we'll be talking about throughout this this session that majority groups do. So that's the work I do. My fun fact, which is related to this, is when I was at BCG in the late 80s. I was the only woman working with our client on feminine hygiene products, the development of feminine hygiene. So I was a focus group of one for our team at the age of 23. And that's how products were made back in the 80s.
That's wonderful, and thank you for sharing a little bit about your work and your fun fact. Johanna, how about you?
Hi, thank you for having me, Ryan, and hello to everyone who's listening live or after the fact. So I'm thrilled to be here. Uh, what diversity means to me, aside from what Alex and Diane mentioned, very, very simply, diversity means the differences between human beings, right? So from that perspective, every place is diverse. And it means a lot more than that, obviously, especially these days. I like to start by sharing how I identify. I am a white, cisgendered, queer woman with Irish ancestry, mostly. And I like to do, and I also have an invisible disability. So I like to identify myself because people make a lot of assumptions about other people. It's just how our brains work. And so by just coming front and center with how I identify, it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. The work that we do at Cadabra is really about building the kinds of cultures that will support a sense of inclusion and belonging. And so that you can have the diversity and keep the diversity, which I think we'll be talking about in a little bit. And it's incredibly important to me from my experience of several experiences of feeling like I didn't belong in lots of places and just not ever wanting anyone else to have that experience. Fun fact about me is people equate me with unicorns for some reason. So I have amassed this collection of unicorn paraphernalia.
That's well, that's wonderful, and yeah, I know unicorns were like a thing a couple years ago, and I just seen them like all over the place, even on like packaged goods and stuff, and it was like so. But thank you for that. That's great sharing, and I think you make a really good point about identifying yourself up front. I identify as a transgender woman, and I think sometimes I got a little bit of stubble, and sometimes people have different assumptions of you, or like my voice is not particularly feminine. So I appreciate everyone sharing their insight on that and just giving a little bit of introduction to their work. So thank you for that. But kind of getting to the heart of today's conversation, I thought a good place to start is kind of look at where we stand with diversity and inclusion, and specifically, our audience is with large corporations, large enterprises. So 2020 really brought diversity and inclusion to the front for a lot of companies. But as 2020 kind of winded down and now we're in 2021, I think some people were a little that they were thinking that, oh, diversity is slipping, with that some of the momentum at the start of last year wasn't carrying over. So I guess my question, Johanna, I'm going to pitch it to you first. We had a little conversation before this, and you made an interesting quote. You said that diversity work doesn't work when it looks at it as an initiative. Can you elaborate on that? I thought that was very interesting. And how might that influence us in 2021?
Yes, I and all the folks at my company, we really look at diversity, equity, and inclusion as the natural part of the natural byproducts of building the right kind of culture. And we know from several decades of doing unconscious bias training that one training to check a box just isn't going to cut it. So we really recommend that organizations look at it as transformational culture change.
That's great. And Diane, I saw you shaking your head a little bit. So did you want to maybe chime in on that angle of just checking the box is.
Well, I'm going to steal Alex's line that she always says, which is there's no diversity finish line. And we feel the same way, that we only work with clients where first there's a commitment from leadership. It has to start at the top We have found when we work with companies where the leader doesn't buy in, it's a lot of talk and no action. So we always start with the CEO. And second, we do inclusive leadership training as well, but we are starting to, what we like to do is work over long periods of time and partner with companies, because it's not just a one and done, check the box, as Johanna said. It is a dialogue. And I always think of myself as a humble student in this area, even though I help lead discussions around it and facilitate workshops. I am learning every single day. And I really do think it takes that humility. There's just, I know I'm making mistakes all the time, and it's that humility of saying, okay, I'm going to do better. And I think that's the way our leaders need to approach this too, I'm going to commit to being an inclusive leader, and I'm going to keep educating myself, and I'm going to keep working to be better. So that's how I approach this work as well.
And Alexandria, did you want to bring us home on this question?
I just feel that companies, I agree with everything my fellow panelists said, but companies have to intertwine DEI in their DNA, which means it has got to become a part of their culture, from their hiring practices to their retention practices, to how they overall treat their employees. So I agree with everything, but it has to be transformational, as Johanna spoke about.
That's a great quote too, and I love that. I'm going to remember that for forever now. But I think that I think everyone touched on this too, is the idea of leadership as being crucial. I mean, it's just kind of known that any initiative in any company needs executive buy-in, but I kind of like what goes into being an effective leader when it comes to diversity, and is there like Diane, what have you noticed in your work, like what a very like good leader in diversity, what do they do?
Yeah, I have a whole list of things. I'll just tick off a few. I started by saying it takes the commitment, you have to model it, you have to message it, and also recognize that this is not just the leader's work. This is everyone's work. And it's not just women's work. It's just not people of color's work. It's not LGBTQ work. It is everyone's work. And I just listened to a podcast this morning about a Black woman who's leading a plant at John Deere, Rosalind Fox. Excellent podcast. But, the reason she got where she got was because of a white male mentor. And he was very intentional about, he wanted to mentor her, and she looks to him for guidance. And so it just amplifies that this takes all of us. I also think, I mentioned humility. I think vulnerability is a key tenet. And in fact, there was a great study by Catalyst on who are the best inclusive leaders. And they are the ones that are humble and vulnerable. And we have had CEOs on our calls that have publicly given themselves an F in front of their team when they do some of their personal reflection inventory that we ask them to reflect on. They are then creating a safe psychological space for everyone on their team to say, okay, I'm not perfect either. I can do better. So those are just a few things that stand out.
And that kind of seems to dovetail with what you were saying, Alexandria, about the diversity in the DNA. So is it just, I mean, is it everyone's work then?
Oh, yes, it's everyone's personal work. I believe that the personal impacts the professional. So many people, how can I be more an effective supervisor on inclusivity? Well, you've got to do that work outside of work hours. You've got to do the work in the morning when you are not in the office, in the evening when you are having dinner with your family and a controversial topic comes up. You've got to do the work outside of the office hours. And so inclusive leaders know that. They know that they've got to be intentional, not just from 8 to 5, but 365 and 24/7. And so being aware of that personal work is just as important as the professional work for companies and organizations.
That's
Ryan,
great.
I'd like to add one additional thought that I think is important. Um, we often talk about, when you're in a non-diverse room, you can move really quickly and make decisions fast. There's a lot of nodding of heads. It's like an echo chamber. Everyone's in violent agreement on everything. Great leaders know how to slow things down. And some of the best leaders I've seen actually say, we got to pause. We are too much aligned. We're not considering every viewpoint, and really taking the time to slow down and listen and try to poke holes in strategies is another way to be a more effective leader, where, Francis Fry, who's at HBS, has said, the hallmark of a great team is when you say, Ryan, I'm so glad you said that, because I never would have thought of that.
Well, and I like the idea of slowing it down too. That I think that especially in the business world that we live in, it's so fast paced that, just listening to people, being humble. I think it's all great. Johanna, did you have anything to kind of wrap up on kind of the topic of leadership?
Yeah, I agree that vulnerability and humility are critical. Like, I often call humility a leader's superpower. And the other thing that I think is really important, and it's related to humility, but it's to take on the idea of being a perpetual student.
Mm-hmm.
You called us DEI experts at the beginning. I do not call myself an expert. Like Diane, I am messing up all day long. But, as Brene Brown talks about being in the arena, one thing I know for sure is that if you're in the arena, you're going to be making mistakes. And 99.99% of the time, those mistakes are not going to kill you. They're going to make you better.
That's
I would just have to say, Joanna, I love everything that you said. Man in the arena is one of my favorite quotes from Brene Brown, because we will be bloodied and we will have our head bowed at times when we do this work. But at least we are in there. We are in the trenches, and we are learning. I totally agree. I do not call myself a DEI expert. If you go to my LinkedIn, it says strategist, because I am always thinking, trying to be proactive, trying to poke holes in learning about a culture. As Diane said, we are strategizing how to be a more effective and equitable organization. So I love that you mentioned Man in the Arena. At least we are trying, at least we are in the trenches trying to do the work.
We talk a lot about having a growth mindset, and one of the tenets of that is that nothing great comes out of your comfort zone. So I absolutely agree that you have to step out of your comfort zone, take some risks, and you will fail at times, but it's how you get back up, and that's going to make you and the organization better long term.
Yeah, and we also do a lot of work with innovation and change management as part of the culture work. And there is a direct connection between innovation and inclusion. The thing that thwarts both of them is being afraid of making mistakes. And the actual technical term for that is cacorophobia. Fun fact. So I always say that if I could change one thing in our culture, it would be how we educate our kids, because we teach them at such an early age that they can't make too many mistakes. But nothing great has ever happened without a whole lot of failure before it.
No, I mean wonderful insight from everyone, and I think that what I'm taking away from this is being humble, make mistakes. We had a session last year where some of these points were echoed, but I think they're all still very valid. And I think this actually kind of segues well into my next question of, Enterprise Connect has a very specific audience in mind, that we're the enterprise IT communication collaboration professionals. It's a mouthful to say. And this industry has historically not been very diverse. And, we hear a lot of people talk about how, that we, for various reasons, the benefits, just having, the ability to innovate better, that enterprises want to be more diverse, but they're always, it seems, kind of going back to the idea that, some people feel like in 2021 things have slowed down since it's, from the height of the summer. How do you break through some of those barriers and actually make some changes? And what do you do to work around those roadblocks? Why don't we start with Alexandria on this one? What do you have any tips to getting around roadblocks and some problems that just might happen in any organization?
So it kind of goes back to our initial question. And so we know this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? And so understanding your why. So why do you want to become a more diverse company, career, organization? So where's your why? Is it to check a box? Is it to, oh, let's get on this DEI train? And so your why will lead you to your how. And your how is, how are we going to attract intentional candidates and then keep them? Because there was some numbers that diversity, equity, inclusion, job postings are up 124% on LinkedIn, right? So that means that companies know that this is important. But what's going to be the true tale of intentionality is in 2 to 3 years from now, are those people that they hired in the 2021, are they still going to be there? And so are you going to hire and are you going to retain? And so it starts with your why, your how, and how you're going to keep these people there and engaged.
I would like to add a few tidbits on the changing workforce, which I think is important for leaders to note. Right now, about 50% of our workforce is millennials. By 2025, it's going to be 75% of the global workforce. And millennials are 56% white. That is contrasted with boomers like me, who are 75% white. So not only is that a 20-point difference in, who you're going to be hiring and retaining, but the millennials have little patience for organizations that don't value diversity. And they're doing their research and they're looking at Glassdoor, they're looking at LinkedIn, they're watching your social media feeds, and they're looking at, are there people that look like me? Are they true to their word? Do people stay? And so, any leader, you asked about what if they're not bought in? Well, they kind of have to be bought in. To Alex's point, they're not going to retain young talent if they're out of step with these developments.
I agree. And I would add that by somewhere between 2040 and 2050, the entire country will be a non-majority white country. So leaders can't afford to not get on this bandwagon. They can't afford to ignore this. And I can tell you, and you all probably have experienced this, employees can sniff out inauthenticity from a mile away. So if you are thinking, oh crap, I really got to pay attention to this because we'll be obsolete otherwise, first of all, that's correct. You will be obsolete. But second of all, back to Alexandria's point, is you've got to connect to a deeper why beyond the box checking. It's got to be like a felt sense of why this is important.
And to the why, I mean, we won't go through all the research here, but BCG and McKinsey, they've done great research on diverse teams, diverse and inclusive teams. And it does drive, as Johanna mentioned, innovation, retention, engagement, attracting
profits and revenue.
And bottom line performance, absolutely. Yeah. And so the smart leaders not only do it because it's, morally the right thing to do, but it is the smart thing to do from a business standpoint.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually an interesting point. I think you mentioned it, Diane, about the workers themselves are looking at, organizations. And I think, especially, with this is a little bit of a tangent, but like with COVID, that authenticity really matters. And that if you're not putting yourself out in a way that people are just going to notice it.
Yeah. And Diane briefly mentioned engagement as well, which is another really important aspect, particularly to this industry that you're representing, right? I did a talk last year, just pre-COVID, so I guess a year and a few months ago now, to a group of cybersecurity professionals. Now, on average, 70% of the workforce is disengaged. And so about 50% of them are just kind of passive, but there's a 20% there that are actively looking to, they're upset, they're mad about something, and they don't want you to succeed. Now, if one of those people is in your IT department and they're responsible for cybersecurity, how much havoc could they wreak? Like, so increasing engagement I always say it's like I don't know why it's a secret to anyone, but it costs American companies $500 billion a year.
Well, and on the engagement front, McKinsey's done some great research lately. Their Women in the Workplace report has shown 1 in 4 women are leaving the workforce right now. And it's even worse for women of color. And we have a client who had 3 strong, talented women come in December and say, I can't do this anymore. I'm out of here. I got young kids, homeschooling, all that. They didn't want to lose them. And back to what do good leaders do? They listen. They are communicating and understanding what the needs are, and they are showing some flexibility. And they did that, and they were able, through some flexible arrangements, to keep 2 of these women they did not want to lose. Because, we are retrenching from all the great progress we've made in the last decade about more gender equity in the workplace. And so companies and leaders really have to be mindful of, what do my people need right now? And it's, lots of people, men, women, are, caregivers, whether it's elderly parents or, now with the vaccine, there are people who don't feel comfortable coming back into the workplace. So there's lots of considerations that leaders need to make. And I think more than ever, they need to lead with empathy and understanding.
I think this pandemic has actually exposed a lot of leaders inefficient to be inclusive leaders. It's exposed people who were not aware that employees are more than their jobs. And so as we have this conversation, we are looking at people's homes, things go awry. We're humanizing a lot of our coworkers and our companies. And if inclusive leaders are not embracing that, then they're missing the mark. I'm talking to CEOs who are just now learning about people that they've worked with via Zoom. Just now knowing people's partners' names or their kids' names because of Zoom. And so this humanization that the pandemic has provided has either exposed, motivated leaders, or motivated them to be more inclusive, or it's totally turned people off into types of companies that they are working in.
We got to meet Johanna's dog before we got started today.
Exactly. See?
That's right.
See, I got a dog sitter, so you couldn't meet my Iris. So.
Oh, that's too bad.
I've met a lot of kids in this pandemic, which has been great.
Yes.
Well, I think that's actually a good point. One of our authors actually kind of wrote about this, and this is a question a comment I'm going to slide into the questions I have, was that, you get to, it's not just your coworkers, but it's the partners, the stakeholders, it's everyone that you come in contact with. I think this also goes to the idea of humility, that, it's now we're all in this circumstance that kind of gave us all a level playing field. And I think it actually, in many ways, brought us closer together. And in some cases, good change has come from that.
It's funny. I used to have all voice calls if it wasn't in person. And now they're like 95% video calls. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, I much prefer them to voice. So there's been, and then we've had a lot of meetings with people from all over the country, even the world, that you can all join in for 1 hour and be off. And that could not have happened, without 3 days of travel for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. So I've enjoyed many of the silver linings that we have to look for.
And that speaks to our audience, because they're the people putting in the technology systems, the video systems to get everyone connected. So that's great.
Thanks to all of you.
Yes, we appreciate
pretty
it.
darn remarkably most of the time.
Well, we appreciate that, and I'm sure they do too. I'm looking at the clock, and we're getting really close to the time, so I'm going to kind of go through, might bunch up a couple questions, but there was Joanna and I spoke before this, and she brought up something very interesting along the lines of, for non-diverse industries, just that psychological safety of just having a space. I thought that might be a good place to kind of pivot to now. And also just in terms of the training and support that we do provide employees. We're talking that we're getting closer to our coworkers and our stakeholders, but is it enough? And what can be done around that? So Johanna, why don't we go to you for that first?
Sure. So Google's Aristotle project researched what are the things that make cohesive, high-performing teams. And what they found is that psychological safety is the number one indicator of great teams. And that is that I know that if I come in with a differing opinion, or I come in and, I've dyed my hair green, or I come to a meeting and my kid is screaming, like that I'm not going to be punished for that. And so how do developing psychological safety is probably, I think, like one of the most complex things that we can do. And one of the reasons it's so complex is because we have a model in our culture of head learning, right? So we go to school, we learn things, we get A's, that means we're awesome, right? But head learning never changes behavior. So we have to pull that head learning down and give people an embodied experience of, what does that mean? What I've just learned, how can I have a felt sense of it so that the next time I encounter the situation, I already know in my body how to respond. So, and the other thing that we do around like what types of training are really effective is we have a 3-part model for belonging that we look at the personal first. So that might be unconscious bias training as part of that. Like, how do I become more self-aware as an individual? Then the interpersonal, which is where most of the training pre-2020, almost all of the training has been in the interpersonal. Let's do this unconscious bias training as a team, and we'll talk about it, and then everything will be solved, except it's not. We have to get really in these interpersonal trainings, we have to practice having these difficult conversations, practice making mistakes, making amends, learning that, oh, right, I just made a huge mistake and it didn't kill me. That's the psychological safety, right? And then the third piece is around what are the systems that are in place that will not only allow us to hire diverse talent, but retain them.
Yeah, and I think the retaining part is just such a huge part. But pitching that to Alexandria, is there what about the providing the support that employees need, and the support around diversity?
I like to go back to something that I'm definitely implementing when I do training. We often throw around the term safe space. And so I want to interject a new term when we're talking about vulnerability and psychological safety, is a brave space. In those brave spaces is where the dialogue begins, is where the accountability begins. Because when we say safe spaces, it's safe spaces for whom? During those unconscious bias trainings, a lot of underrepresented groups felt left out in the conversation because they were not able to show up and be authentic with their colleagues who often held racist or sexist or transphobic ideology. And so when we start these conversations, let's start with a brave space, which encourages psychological safety and also holds accountability in those spaces so that we can understand each other and also hold each other accountable for recognizing differences and continuing to have those courageous conversations. Just wanted to interject that.
Exactly. We don't talk about, I agree, we don't talk about safe spaces. We talk about brave spaces. And in fact, the culture work that we do, we call it brave cultures.
That's great. And that's something, a new term that I've learned today. So, Diane, did you want to chime in anything with this in terms of just brave spaces, providing support, and yeah.
Well, I think one of the elements of the brave space that Alex just talked about is being an ally. And that is one of the hardest things, I think, for people to do because they're so worried about making mistakes. And sometimes, being quiet or not getting involved is the easier path. And we really provide a toolkit when we go into companies with very specific words to use and words to not use and consider this, not this, and think about how this lands. And we talk about microaggressions and a lot of people I think have a hard time with that because they didn't intend for it to land the way it did. And so we talk a lot about intent versus impact. And yes, your intent may not have been to harm. I think generally it's not. But the impact is still harmful. And so how do you get yourself out of that situation while acknowledging that this is how this landed for this particular individual? And so I agree with Johanna. It does take practice. You can learn all the tools and you can read the instruction manual, but until you have these brave and courageous conversations and make some mistakes and learn what you could do better, that's really how the work I think is most effective.
Got it. And it's 40 minutes just zoomed by. So I think that just to kind of wrap it up, why don't we do like one takeaway in terms of if someone was watching this, what's the one thing that they should take back to their team? So Alexandria, why don't we start with you?
I'd like to thank you for this space. Thank you for the information that was shared with my co-panelists. One thing that I hope they take away is that you've got to do the personal work. Many people often ask, Alex, what are you reading? What should I read to start my diversity journey? What should I listen to? And then I ask them, what have you already done? So it doesn't matter how many resources that I give you. If you are not already being proactive in some type of way, then it's of no consequence. And so I want people to understand to do the work on their own, start that journey, and then maybe reach out to people that are on this call, maybe reach out to our organizations and get other resources, but you've got to do the work. You've got to do the work on your own individual time. And so that's something that I would like everyone to take away.
Good takeaway. And yeah, put in the work. I mean, that relates to so many things. And Diane, how about you? What's the one takeaway like a leader?
There's been so much, I think, so many great nuggets that my colleagues have put forth. The one thing we didn't talk about, though, is the importance of accountability. And what I've noticed is the companies that are making the most progress in this area are very outwardly vocal about their commitments. And I mean, just this morning, Twitter in the news said, 25% of our execs by 2025 are going to be people of color. 41% are going to be women, of Facebook, Google. A lot of companies are really putting this out there. And I think people have been timid in the past, but by putting it out there, they're creating a culture that is aligned around these important objectives.
And Johanna?
Yeah, I think what both Alex and Diane shared are incredibly important. And I would add, so the model that we use is actually a trauma-informed model. And I know this is probably a very heavy thing to end with, but I do think it's important to understand that everyone in this dominant culture has been negatively impacted by the culture. So we all carry at least a little bit of trauma, and that trauma is going to get triggered the first time we make a mistake and the 100th time we make a mistake. And so just give yourself some grace as you hold yourself accountable in doing this really deep personal transformational work.
Well, that's wonderful, and we're all up on time, but I want to thank all our panelists again for joining us today. All the insight was great. I really appreciated this conversation, and thank you again. So
thank you so much for having me.
You.
Thank you. And I would like to just, everyone that attended this session, I would just like to point out that the recording of this presentation will be available on demand, and you could view it at Enterprise Connect's YouTube page. And we encourage you to share with colleagues. Like I said, thank you all again for attending, and enjoy the rest of the show.